We are going to get started. We're going to here. My name is Eileen Arthur. I'm the Education Chair of the Racial Equality and Justice Committee. And we are really excited about having this program. We're really happy Pat said yes. And I'm going to have Zelda introduce Pat because he and Joan have traveled around to many of these sites with Pat. So there's some knowledge there that I don't possess. So anyway, welcome. We're glad you're here. Thank you.
Thanks, Eileen. And good evening, and we are glad that you're here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Pat. He wrote stuff, but no, I'm going to stick to the script. I
Can I make comments?
am.
No.
Can I say, no, that's not right?
Pat's our speaker this evening, and he's going to talk about, obviously, Emmett Till, and he has a wealth of information. And he comes about this because of his intense curiosity and also out of his care and concern for his neighbor. And you know what I mean when I say neighbor. But that's where this comes from. So I want you to know that about Pat. Pat grew up in a small family farm outside of Decatur, Indiana, which is about 20 miles south of Fort Wayne. The youngest of 6 boys. Believe he was known as number 6. And as a young boy, he was moved by watching the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite when he saw the segment where protesters in Birmingham, Alabama were being hosed with fire hoses, and the violence against the protesters in Selma, Alabama. And he asked the question out loud, why are those people being treated that way? Pat attended Purdue and earned a Bachelor of Arts in Communication and a Master of Science in Organizational Leadership and Supervision. He attended St. Thomas as a student in the mid-70s and has continued to do so through that. Pat worked at the Exponent as a student for 4 years and was hired full-time after graduation and became a production director for 6 years. And then, as many of you probably know, he served as publisher of the Exponent for 38 years before retiring this past December. Pat has done extensive volunteer work very quietly, and that work included jail ministry, hospice volunteer, and adult guardian. You've probably seen him with a big camera in his hand, especially when we do the Order of Christian Initiation for adults. He does Breaking Open the Word. He's photographed any number of St. John's events, most notably Easter Vigil. Pat has visited historic civil rights sites in the South for the last 7 years while driving to and from Florida to visit family at Christmas. As we were talking, Pat mentioned, well, I'm going through Georgia, I'm passing by this state. So I got to a point where it was like, well, I'm here, why don't I start to look for something? So he started that 7 years ago. And then about 4 years ago, we agreed that he began talking about these places that he'd gone to. And then put out the idea that perhaps we could do a trip together. Of course, we had to wait for Pat to retire. But when he did, he made good on that talk. And we did take the trip in May. And we saw many of these sites you're gonna see in the video or that Pat will mention. And our travel companion was Joan Cather. She went with us. And it was just an amazing adventure. So with that, I give you our speaker for the evening, Pat Kuhnle.
So the obvious question is, how did I get with Zelda and Joan? And the real reason is because I went to confession and that was my penance. Okay, I'm gonna hand out a handout, and you have to promise me you're not gonna go beyond the first page at this moment. And I've got some more up here, because you're cheating on some of the questions I'm gonna answer. Here, go ahead. Have some more. And some more. Yeah. So as those are moving along, I'm going to open with a prayer. And this is from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and it has to do with racial equality. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Wake me up, Lord, so that the evil of racism finds no home within me. Keep watch over my heart, Lord, and remove me any barriers to your grace that may oppress and offend my brothers and sisters. Fill my spirit, Lord, so that I may give services of justice and peace. Clear my mind, Lord, and use it for your glory. And finally, remind us, Lord, that you said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Amen. Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Now, I think a reading from Scripture would be appropriate. And so you can follow along with me. It's the front page of your handout. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring an oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any expense that you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. So I think the question becomes, as we go into civil rights history, is who's my neighbor? Because in the United States, we haven't always been good to our neighbors. Zelda implied some of the places I go. These are some of the photos that I've taken along the way. That's the Civil Rights Museum in Montgomery, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. There is the Rosa Parks. That's the location where she picked up that bus in Montgomery. On the upper right, which is covered by that video, that is the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church where Martin Luther King's parish was in Montgomery. Down below is the balcony in Memphis where he was shot and killed. Bottom left, you see Lewis's grave in Atlanta, King's grave in Atlanta. The next one is Selma, and the final one you see up there is this Tuskegee. I've been to all those places, plus some others. So I've done a lot of research on that. And as Zelda said, I was moved when I was 6 years old watching the CBS Evening News. It's like, why are they doing this to these people, both in Selma and also in Birmingham? And I remember my mother saying at the time, it's like, I don't know, honey, I don't know. And I remember my dad saying, they should all be put in jail, those protesters. And there was that dichotomy. And we all had that dichotomy, right? And so that's what I remember from it. And I always wanted to go to Selma after that. And so it took a long time until I got there. And it's a very moving place, as I can talk about any of those locations. There's some others I've been to, like if you ask me questions afterwards, I got quite a story about going to Charleston, South Carolina, where the shooting of the 9 people in a Bible study. I went there and I actually talked to some people who were at the site that day. So I've had a lot of interest in that. So this is why I don't want you to look at any other page, Joan. So pivotal rights and civil rights history in the United States, what order do they come to? And let me read them to you, and then I'm going to ask you which one you thought happened first, which one happened last. The murder of Emmett Till, Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat on the bus, 3 students murdered for voting registration, Montgomery bus boycott, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, Selma's Voters' Right March to Montgomery, Medgar Evers' assassination, the Voting Rights Act, federal anti-lynching law passed by Congress, George Wallace inauguration speech about segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever, the March on Washington, the Birmingham 16th Avenue church bombing, the Martin Luther King parsonage bombing, or the Brown v. versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling outlawing segregation. So what one did you think happened first?
Brown versus Board of Education.
Okay, anybody else have a different answer? Yes. Okay.
I was thinking the 3 students. Medgar Evers and Emmett Till is close.
What was the most recent one? The which one? The which lynching? The anti-federal lynching law? Okay.
Oh, wait. I just had it. I just got it.
And it disappeared?
You forgot.
Something happened. I don't want to spoil it. Something happened in 1900.
We're gonna get there. This is the order. Brown v. Free versus Board of Education. You are correct. 1954. You now may look at your sheets. Yes. Murder of Emmett Till was second in 1955, August 28th. Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat in the bus, December 1st, 1955. How many days after Emmett Till's murder? 100. It was intentional. She picked that day to honor Emmett Till. When she was arrested, she said, I'm doing this in memory of Emmett Till. Montgomery bus boycott from December 5th, 1955 through December 20th, 1956. Martin Luther King's parsonage was bombed during that period. George Wallace inauguration speech was in 1963. Medgar Evers' assassination also in 1963. The Birmingham church bombings in 63. The Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech in 1963. Look at the date. 8 years after the lynching of Emmett Till. That too was intentional. March on Washington, of course, the same day. The 3 students murdered for voter registration. June 21st, 1964. Now notice what I put in red there, a little known fact. August 30th, 1980, presidential candidate Ronald Reagan's first campaign speech after his nominations was in that town. where he talked about states' rights. And he said that the South will rise again. Now, why did he do that? Well, it was political. Because George Wallace in 1968 had won 5 southern states. Southern states always voted Democratic. That was the change that became the South. The South now is all Republican, and it turned when Reagan went down there. Summer's Voter Rights Act in 1965, the Voters' Rights Act, or excuse me, the March in 1965, Voting Rights Act 1965, federal lynching laws 2022. It was first introduced in 1900. 2022 is the first time we've had lynching laws in the federal law book. I'm going to go through some key figures because we're going to talk about them in the Emmett Till story, and they're also on your sheet because all these people I will refer to as I go on. I want you to kind of keep score of the people I'm talking about. Roy Bryant was a murder suspect. He died in 1994. Carolyn Bryant, who was the subject of the wolf whistle, died in 2023, 3 weeks before we went down to the Mississippi Delta. J.W. Milam, the half-brother of Roy Bryant, died in 1990. He was also one of the murder suspects. Leslie Milam, the brother of J.W., he was a manager of a seed barn that we'll cover here in a moment. He died in 1974. Mamie Till Mobley, the mother of Emmett Till, died in 2003. Moses Wright, Mose, as he was referred to, is the great uncle of Emmett Till. His house is where the abduction occurred. He died in 1977. Simeon Wright, Mose's youngest son and the uncle of Wheeler, died in 2017. And what's interesting is Simeon Wright is actually 4 years younger than Wheeler Parker, the next person, even though he was his uncle. Because Mose Wright and his 2 wives had 20 children. Reverend Wheeler Parker, the grandson of Mose Wright from Summit, Illinois, he is the sole living witness who was in the house during the Till abduction. Willie Reed, he was a witness to J.W. Milam at the murder site. And I put those quotes in there because there's been various arguments about where the murder site was, and we're going to cover that as well. He died in 2013. William Bradford Huey, the author of the Look magazine Confession Story, he died in 1986. I put the word confession in there because we're going to cover that part of this story as well. Sheriff Clarence Strider, he was the investigating officer for Emmett Till being missing and then finding the body. He was not a prosecution witness. He was a defense witness. Think of that. Levi Too Tight Collins, a black accomplice in the Till murder, died in 1992. Henry Lee Loggins, probable accomplice, he died in 2005. And Johnny B. Thomas, the stepson of Loggins, who is the mayor of Glendora, Mississippi, yet today, who we met. And he runs the Ethic Museum, which we're going to talk about here in a minute as well. So as I go through this, you may refer back and forth. Who are these people? Because they're all part of this story that I'm going to tell. Some key dates in the Emmett Till murder. August 20th, 1955, Till arrives in Mississippi from Chicago. So why was it that Emmett Till was going from Chicago to the Delta? Well, Emmett's mother and father, they did not meet when they were in the Delta, but they were part of this mass exodus from the Delta to the Chicago area to work in a corn manufacturing plant called Argo. And we'll talk about that as well. And Emmett was actually born in Chicago. So his great uncle, Mose Wright, had been in Chicago for a funeral because he was a preacher, including a sharecropper. So he was in Chicago and he invited his grandson, Reverend Wheeler Parker, to come back down with him before school started, right before Labor Day. And Emmett, being the next door neighbor and cousin to Reverend Wheeler Parker and the best friends, it's like, I want to go, I want to go, I want to go. And that's when his mother had conversations with him about how you do things in the South. When Emmett went on the train from Argo area, which is now Summit, down to the Mississippi Delta, it was the 3rd time he had been there. The first time was when he was 9 months old with his mother, so he didn't remember it. The second time is when he was 9 years old. And so he was always within earshot of his mother. And they didn't really leave the Mosrite property at that time. So he didn't know what some of the Southern customs really were. So she tried to train him on how blacks are supposed to act in Mississippi. For example, if you're walking down the street and a white person comes, you are to get off the sidewalk and keep your head down, never make eye contact. That was the custom. It's always yes, sir, yes, ma'am, never disagreeing, never maintaining eye contact. And Emmett was kind of a free spirit, as you'll hear in some of these videos. And he didn't listen real well. So, August 24th, a wolf whistle at the Bryant's Grocery. Do you know what I mean by a wolf whistle? It's a, you know, it's like saying something to pretty girl, and there's no question that he did that to Carolyn Bryant. There's questions about everything else. That one we know is true because everyone seems to think that's true. He was abducted on August 28th at his great uncle's house. August 31st is when his body was found in the Tallahatchie River. September 19th, with the murder trial started for the two suspects. And interesting enough, see how quickly that murder trial occurred. Pretty quick. They were found not guilty 4 days later after about an hour of the jury negotiations. November 9th, the LaFleur County Grand Jury fails to indict Bryant and Milam on kidnapping. Now, why is that important? You're going to see a map of the different counties that are involved. They admitted to going and taking him from the house. There was never any question about that. But they were found not guilty on the murder. And then because LaFleur County is where Mosrite house was versus where his body was found on the murder charge, the sheriff in that county pushed for them to get arrested. He took it before the grand jury and they failed to indict, even though they admitted to doing it. As I mentioned before, Rosa Parks was arrested 100 days after the murder of Emmett Till. January 24th, 1956, Look magazine publishes the Huey story where they admit guilt. They were paid $3,150 for each one of their stories. And they also signed off on the movie rights because Huey anticipated doing a movie on this, which did not ever occur. August 28th, 1963, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. 2004, Keith Boykamp documentary, The Untold Story of Emmett Till. Have anybody seen that? It's excellent. It's thick, but it is excellent. The 2004, the FBI opened up an investigation on the murder because of Boykamp's documentary. Now, they couldn't be, nobody else could be tried for murder because the statute of limitations were over. So what they were trying to do is they were trying to talk into witnesses and get them to lie to FBI agents because that's a federal crime. There was no federal lynching crimes. So that's what they were trying to trick them to do, and that didn't occur. And in 2005, Till's body was exhumed to prove that it was him, because part of the defense's argument all along is the body that was found in the river had been in the river for 10 days, and they had people who said that that was true, witnesses. But of course, it was Emmett Till, and they proved it when they exhumed his body and the DNA. You can ask a question.
What's the difference between murder and you said there's no federal lynching? Wouldn't it just be the federal?
Murder was a state law. Lynching is now a federal law. And so kidnapping was also a local law. There were no federal laws that prevented what they did in the term that they did it in 1955. Today they can't. But 1955, there are no such federal laws. In 2008, 50 years after the murder of Emmett Till, the first sign of commemoration appeared in the Mississippi Delta. 50 years. 2017, the LaFleur County Grand Jury found no credible evidence that up to 14 different people were involved in the murder. And you're going to hear some people who were interviewed who said that there were multiple people involved, even though only 2 got arrested. 2017, later with additional information, they reopened the investigation again. 2022 is an active warrant was found in the Greenwood courthouse. Has anybody heard that story? Boykamp started this when he started looking for evidence, and his followers, this group of people, went and looked in the files of the Emmett Till files in the courthouse in Greenwood. Now, that county, Tallahatchie County, interesting enough, had 2 courthouses. Sumner is where the defendants were tried, and Greenwood was where they stored the material. And the FBI did not find the transcripts of the trial until 2004 when they were going through that investigation. Now, there's a prosecuting attorney in 2022 was going through those files and found an active warrant for the arrest of Carolyn Bryant that was dated 1956 for her part in the kidnapping. It was never served. Why? There was a note in there from Sheriff Strider that said she's got 2 small children. And it never saw the light of day until 2022. It was brought to a grand jury and they did not indict her because they didn't have witnesses. Now, see, that they could still do because it was a new charge, even though it would have to apply to 1955 laws. And kidnapping can go back that far, but she was never originally charged, so that's why they can do it. And then in April 2023, Carolyn Bryant died. Okay. Now, that's a lot of thick history. So we're going to move on from that, I hope. Okay, Vince, I'm not playing well now. I can sheet, can I? Yeah, where's the arrow though? Okay. Okay, what do you know of the Till lynching? How old was he? He had just turned 14. He was 2 weeks beyond 14. Why was he in Mississippi? I covered that. Okay. The wolf whistle, we know what that is. How did he die? I don't know. That's a good answer. He was beaten. He was shot. Yep. It was very, very brutal. How many people were involved in the lynching? I gave you a clue. Only 2 were charged, but up to 14 different people were involved. And why is he buried in Chicago? Is because that's where he's from. Okay. Now we're going to show you some video. And this is from The Lost Story of Emmett Till Then and Now. It's a documentary. It's a mini series documentary from NBC Chicago, Channel 5. It was made last year. And the reason I'm using this is because it takes some of Bull Camp's interviews.
Lost Story of Emmett Till, Then and Now.
One of the most shameful elements of this nation's past. Stain, a bitter stain on America.
That part's just short. Just to introduce what we're talking about here. Okay, Bryant's grocery store and meat market. And behind the screen there, it actually says a lie number 1. At the trial, when the jury was not present, Carolyn Bryant testified. He testified that Emmett Till touched her when he paid for the items in the store. Okay, that wasn't illegal, but it was unheard of. So she testified that he put coins in her hand. There's no witness to that. That's what she testified. That was outside the jury. They were outside the jury because the prosecution never entered into evidence what had happened at the store. They just focused on the murder site and what happened there. They said this had nothing to do with it because the prosecution was afraid that people would be sympathetic to the murderers if it was justified. So she testified outside outside the jury presence. You two have been there. How far is it from the jury room to where the testimony is?
Oh. Not
Here to the end of the table.
Yeah, indeed.
And there's a hollow wooden door between. They could clearly hear what was going on. Clearly. She was testifying to the court reporters in case they were going to use as evidence. The judge ruled that it was not admissible because it had nothing to do with the murder per se. But that doesn't mean the jury didn't hear it. She also testified that Till had touched her on the waist and the shoulder. And then she actually showed how that had occurred. Okay, the two major witnesses who were in the store for 100% of the time, except for what they estimated to be 20 seconds, testify that never happened. That's Wheeler Parker and Simeon Wright. They said it never happened. That was the argument that she went out of the store and got her gun, if you've heard that story. What's interesting is that the way the store was set up, there was a counter. And they said that Emmett Till had gone around the counter to touch her. He wouldn't have had enough time. But again, the prosecution never entered that, so that they never got to argue that. But that's what she told them. She said that he made a suggestive comment. Emmett Till had a severe stutter. And they said for him to get anything out with it, whenever he started any sentence. And his mother taught him if he couldn't speak to whistle, and then he could do it. But it was always a delay. And the cousins said there's no way he could have done it because of his stuttering problem. Then he also said during that time, "Hey baby, how about a date?" That's what she testified to. Then they said that he replied, "Don't worry, I've been with white women before." Now, the people who were there said none of that happened. Now, this Huey in Look magazine in his book reiterates the perspective justifying the lynching. Okay. This book here. It's a follow-up to what Huey wrote in Look magazine. When he wrote the article in Look magazine in January of 1956, he interviewed the two murder suspects who were found not guilty and their attorneys. When he was writing to Look magazine after he did the interviews, he wrote Look magazine a letter because he was a freelance journalist. And he said, "I have identified the 4 people who were involved in the murder, and I am getting their releases." And what he meant by releases is that if someone is found not guilty in court, media can't say that they were murdered. Otherwise, they open themselves up for libel. So he was getting releases from them that they would not sue him for libel, even though they were found not guilty. Those two signed it, and they got $3,150. The next letter came 2 days later to Look magazine and said, "I've got the releases from the 2 murder suspects." Drops 2 people immediately. Yes, sir.
Isn't that law changed because remember there was that no charges, they were running the whole court trial, then they found not guilty, then admitted that they killed their parents later, and then they were able to indict them based on that?
If you're found not guilty of murder, you can no longer face a murder charge. But in the Menendez brothers, I believe they were brought back in manslaughter charge. There's double jeopardy. You can't do it like. Okay. So he wrote the story that's expanded upon in this book that there was only 2 people that were in that truck who held him down. A 14-year-old boy, 5'2", 150 pounds, sitting in the back of the truck, and they're in the cab, and he doesn't run away. Really? Think about that. That couldn't have happened. It just couldn't have happened. And Huey also, when you read it, the more extended portion of his interview, this is trash. I don't know any other way of saying it. And it's original to 1956. It took me a while to find that book. He changed the murder site to the Tallahatchie River on the bank. And in that story, it says that Till's cousins said that they were part of setting up Emmett Till to go in there and say those things to that woman. He never talked to the 2 cousins. Okay, why did he do all this? You know, he was trying to make a movie. He was trying to get a script for the movie. And he also agreed, believe it or not, is that the story that he supplied to Look magazine would have to be approved by the two suspects and their attorneys. My training is in journalism. You never let the sources decide what you print. He was doing it for money. So that's the problem with Huey and his book in the Look magazine article. But from 1956 until 2004, that was the narrative, even though in the trial, other evidence came out. So there's a reason for that, because it doesn't cross county lines then, and then other jurisdictions aren't involved. So don't believe what you read in that book, but it's still interesting reading. Yes.
So the whistle was part of his speech trying to not.
He could whistle without stuttering because he would have had to stutter. And he was a show off. So he was showing off to all the boys there. Look at that pretty girl. And that's when she pulled the gun. He was just trying to impress me. He was a show off. Okay, Wheeler Park and Simeon Wright dispute that, but that wasn't until 50 years later. Interesting enough, those two, Simeon Wright and Wheeler Parker, who were there, did not talk about this for 50 years. You know what changed? No, everybody pretty much was dead. No, Mamie, Till's mother, was dying. And she went to them, you have to tell the story now. And Wheeler Parker is the one who took the lead on that and said, yes, I will. But he never spoke of it for 50 years. Okay. These are some photos I took. This is what Money, Mississippi looks like today, where the Bryant grocery store is. On the lower right, that's the front of the store now. Up above it that's from the side of the street. And there's a gas station next to it, which is somewhat renovated. It was renovated in 2004. I'm going to talk about that in a second. And then there's a sign up there that talks about what had happened at Bryant's grocery store. This is, I believe, the fourth sign there because they have been abused. But that's what it looked like in May when I was there.
How were the signs abused?
One was thrown an acid, others were shot with bullets, and others were run over by vehicles. Yeah. Okay. Here's the area of Mississippi that we're talking about in the right. You can see the Mississippi Delta. That is the area of the Mississippi River that floods and makes it very rich land. And that's where the primary crop is cotton. Now, in the one on the left side, you see the different counties that are involved. Upper right, Sumner County. Okay, you can see where the body was found. And it was found, there's a good question on this. Was it found in Tallahatchie County on one side versus one jurisdiction versus the other? Because they had two courthouses. They determined it was in the middle, and that's why it ended up in Sumner, when actually it was on the bank of the other side. LaFleur County is where Greenwood is. And that's part of this story because that's where J.W. Milam lived. And some argued that his body was taken there, that he was beaten there. And then Sunflower County, which is actually where he was murdered in a barn. And that barn story didn't come out until 2005. So you can see, and these places, I didn't realize till I got there is how far apart they were. From Sumner over to that barn is 30 miles. And you think about it, Emmett Till was abducted at 2:30 in the morning. And the next time that the two murderers were seen in their truck is at 6:30 in the morning. So they would have gotten rid of the body by then. And if you read Huey's book, they say they went up beyond Sumner into along the Mississippi River where there were cliffs, and they scared him and acted like he was going to push him over. That's what it says in that book, because it fit the narrative of his movie. Okay, Bryant's grocery store. This is lie number 2. Bryant's grocery store closed less than a month after the murder in 1955 because the blacks refused to go shop there. Wong's grocery store followed, but closed sometime in the 80s. No, there's no historical record when that was. Then the front floor collapsed in the 1990s. Interiors fell by 2000. Hurricane Katrina essentially did the rest of it in 2009. In 2011, the money received $206,000 grant to renovate the neighboring gas station. Now, if you go to the gas station, one of the things that they did was they said they had to put the bathrooms the way they were, of colored and white. Did they, Zelda? No. Okay. The owner of that gas station is Ray Tribble, who's now deceased. Anybody know who Ray Tribble was? He was a juror. There's 3 children on the property. The Emmett Till Foundation in Sumner tried to buy the grocery store before it collapsed. The family wanted $4 million. The family owns 100% of the town of Money, which is very small today, much smaller than what it was even back then. There isn't anything in that county, or maybe not even the county itself, that's worth $4 million. They still refuse to sell. Isn't that interesting that the children of one of the jurors bought up everything in town? Then he's like, okay, I can make money on this by getting $200,000 to renovate this gas station that nobody uses. And we call that a historical site. And there is no reference to Emmett Till on that site whatsoever. None. And also by 1951, interesting enough, blacks boycotted the white-owned gas stations. This is before the Emmett Till murder. So why would this gas station have any historical value whatsoever? It was a free fall for the Tribble family.
Good question about the church. Is it a black church that's not owned or a white church?
It is a white church. They don't own that. It's a Baptist church. The church wouldn't sell. Okay, this is what Ben Roy's service station looks like today. And it's 67 feet away from the grocery store. And there's nothing on that property that says anything about Emmett Till. But they're the ones that got the historical money. Okay, lie number 2, the barn lie. From 1956 to 2004, the barn was not part of the history. And I mentioned that before. And that was because of the Huey interview. There was the amount they were paid. The attorney was paid $1,269. Huey got those signed agreements. I talked about that. Brian Lynham and attorneys got to read the story before, and they had to sign a line that says, I have read the draft and I am fine with it. Anything that Willie Reed said about the murder, and you're going to hear quotes from Willie Reed, he said at the trial. But for whatever reason, history after 1956 did not include his narrative. Huey moved the murder site from Sunflower County to the banks of the Tallahatchie River. Why? Because they could have it in a friendly location in that courtroom. And interesting enough, the Tallahatchie River, everything west of the Tallahatchie River, which runs to the Mississippi River, is very flat. Everything on the other side is like hilly. There were 2 jurors from the west side of the river, and there were 10 jurors from the east side. Okay, why is that important? Because the sharecroppers were all on the west side. There were some whites who were sympathetic to blacks who lived in that area because they had to depend on them for labor. The blacks didn't work on the east side, and they were very racist. So you heard, have you heard yet that the sheriff picked all the jurors? Okay. That's why the jury is picked that way. It's like you picked the people who you knew would be in your favor. So the whole lie about this, about the barn, was solved later on, and I'm going to talk about that in a second as well. Okay, what does it look like today? These are photos I took in May. The top left one is, if you know the story about where Willie Reed was, he stopped along the road to get water. It was a little bit pre-dawn. He was walking on a Sunday morning to essentially the back 40, if you're familiar with that terminology. He was going down a county road to get to the farm so he could start feeding the cattle. So you get that, you do that before dawn. And he heard the whipping, and you'll hear him talk about that in the barn. So this picture is taken from where the water used to be. It's not there now. And then I turned around and took a picture back at the house. That's the upper right. That is not the house that was there before. It actually was torn down and rebuilt. But you know, I just did a turn. And so we're talking about on the left side, that's probably 80 feet. Turn to the right side, it's about 40 feet. So he clearly could have heard things walking down that road. That's the shed lower left today. The only thing that's different from 1955 is the door. They changed the door. And on the lower right, you can actually see what's in there. Interestingly enough, the floorboards, the wall boards are all the same from 1955. And even that petrified wood has been there since 1955. This is, by the way, that property is owned by a local dentist. He doesn't allow everybody there. We had a tour guide who has permission to be on the property. Maybe I'll tell the story now. Joan and Zelda, they were really tired. They wanted to go back in my car where the air conditioning was because it was hot down there.
It was.
So I was standing at the doorway and the owner came up to me. And he said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Indiana." He said, "Where in Indiana?" I said, "West Lafayette." And he said, "I graduated from Mississippi State. I have season basketball tickets to Mississippi State. My second favorite team in the nation is Purdue." And I said, "What?" And he says, "I started watching Matt Painter's teams about 10 years ago. I love the way they play, and I don't miss a game unless I'm at a Mississippi State game." How's that for weird, you know? So I talked to him for quite a while, and I also asked him, and you're going to hear a little bit different story in that when I show a video. I said, "When'd you buy this property?" He said, 1995. And in a video, a voiceover said 1992. He told me 1995. I'll go with 1995. I said, "When did you learn that this was the location of Emmett Till's murder?" 2004. I said, "How did you learn in 2004? He said, "I came home for lunch and the barn was surrounded by FBI. What were they looking for? Emmett Till.
Really? The mayor and, I mean.
She was connected. She was upper middle class. If you see photos of Emmett and her on Christmas, that's when she bought him a TV in 1952. If anybody's old enough in this room from 1952, did you own a TV? We didn't own a TV at home until after the 1960s.
We had one in 1951.
Well, it was on the expensive side of the street.
My mother told my father, "I won't raise a child without."
Mamie Till had a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. She started out as a teacher and she worked for the U.S. Air Force.
What about his father?
Louis Till, he's an interesting character too. Louis Till was a philanderer. He was accused of sexual assault in Chicago. There wasn't enough evidence, but the sheriff came to him and said, "Look, you've been a problem and we'll look the other way if you join the military." So he joined the military, was shipped off to Europe, and in Europe he died. How did he die in Europe? He was accused of a sexual assault, was convicted and hung. Later, the person who did the sexual assault admitted to it. Louis Till was not guilty. So Louis Till died, and that's why his mother got the personal effect from it, which included the ring that said LT, which is the ring that Emmett wore when we went down to Mississippi, and that's how I identified his body. We're good now?
Which is amazing they can steal the ring.
I know, they weren't thinking.
And this is works too.
Okay. All right, now we're to Drew, Mississippi, where the barn is.
After kidnapping Emmett Till, it's believed J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant brought him here, to this barn in Drew, Mississippi. Drew is about 30 miles from Money in Sunflower County. That day, an 18-year-old named Willie Reed saw Emmett.
The only place I ever saw him was when he was on the back of that truck.
In 2004, the FBI brought Willie Reed back to this barn.
You know, this is the area when the FBI showed up.
Dentist Jeff Andrews bought the barn in 1992, and he still owns it today.
The FBI brought him here, and he said this was the location where he heard the screams. He didn't see.
You see 3 black people on the truck. You see a young one, and then you see 2 old ones, and then you see 2 white men, and they go into that barn.
I saw him motion and say, I was walking down this road right here, and he pointed at the driveway.
But when I get near that barn and hear that beating that on out there, I know it.
You know, if he heard that and he was this close, I'm sure he probably didn't stick around too long. So, you know, because you see how close proximity that is. But, you know, this was the area here, and that
So this is the Black Bayou Bridge on the south side of Glendora. So the belief is that the murderers left the barn in Drew with Till wrapped in a tarp, either beaten within an inch of his life or perhaps even dead. But then they brought him back to Glendora, where they obtained the cotton gin fan, and then brought him to this bridge and dropped him in the river through the gap in these V-shaped girders right here.
The body of 14-year-old Emmett Till, weighed down by a gin fan, was tossed into the water. It's not clear exactly where Emmett Till's body was thrown or exactly where it was found. But 3 days after his kidnapping, Emmett Till's body was found.
It shouldn't have been found. Because they had it weighted, they had it properly done to weight it down. But going downstream, it snagged.
Imagine being 17 years old and fishing on a beautiful day like you might do any other time in your life, and noticing 2 knees bobbing out of the Tallahatchie River. That's exactly what happened when Emmett Till's body was discovered.
Once Emmett's body was pulled out of the river, Mamie Till made 3 key decisions that cemented her son's legacy as a catalyst for the civil rights movement. First, she ordered his body back to Chicago.
I remember being with her when we stayed up all night waiting on the body to come in from Mississippi. And when it did come in, she demanded that the body be opened so the world could see what they did to my boy.
Mamie secondly ordered her son Emmett's casket remain open. Tens of thousands would file past it at Robert's Temple and see.
And when they opened the casket in the funeral home, I remember a piece of his skull fell off, and my photographer went over and reached over and picked it up and put it back on before he shot a picture.
And that picture, Mamie allowing that picture to be taken and then published by Jet Magazine, was her 3rd pivotal decision.
So very gruesome scene, but she was a tough lady.
It was courageous. It was very courageous. Pictures worth 1,000 words.
I mean, the world needed this shock. They needed it. I think it really let us see the ugly monster that race hatred is. It's almost as if it was embodied in his appearance and his physical appearance, because it is a monster.
She changes everything in that moment. She wants the world to see what they've done to my son.
Till's body was found in the Black Bayou. It contributed to the Tallahatchie and what's close to that. So I want to give you some proximity. If you look to the right in that photo, that's another bridge over the Tallahatchie River. That's also another site that they believe the body was thrown into the river. This is a sign that will take you down to Gravel Landing, which is where they believe his body was found. And these are pictures that I took in May. So if you look at these photos and the proximity of things, it's really interesting. Upper left, J.W. Milam's house. It's a pile of rubble now. It just fell last year, they told me. To the right is a cotton gin where J.W. Milam worked. 50 feet away from his house. Gee, I wonder how they got a cotton fan. Behind J.W. Milam's house is farmland for maybe a couple hundred yards. You know what's on the other side of the farmland? The Black Bayou River. You can stand at that location of that sign and see all of that. I never had any clue that they were next to each other. That barn is 30 miles away, mind you, but this is all right together. So this is a photo looking down the river at the Grable Landing site. And right over here is where the Black Bayou River comes in. And so where I'm standing taking this photo is where the kid was fishing and found the feet right over here. There's the Grable Landing sign. That is the third sign since 2017. The other ones have been shot up and destroyed. The first one was shot up within 35 days of the time it was put up. Okay, lie number 3, Glendora Cotton Mill. The Ethics Center, which is a place that we went, in the cotton mill, there's part of a museum there. That's presumably where the cotton gin fan came from and the barbed wire that was tied around his neck when he was found in the river. Mayor Johnny Thomas, who we met, owns the Ethics Center as a stepson of Henry Lee Loggins. If you remember, he's one of the murderers. And so Johnny Thomas talks about how his stepfather was one of the murderers. The Mississippi Department of Archives and History disputes all of his claims and consequently wouldn't give him any money. So he went to the U.S. Department of Agriculture that gave him $325,000 to bring broadband to a very, very poor area of the United States. He got that grant. And with that grant, he applied with it with a bid of how it was going to be used. He fired the contractor, he took it himself, he hired his family and prisoners to redo this computer lab, which is part of that facility that we visited, that is no longer in use, by the way. He used the money to then develop this museum that he claims all this stuff happened. Now, the National Archives, the Atlanta Archives don't believe it. The U.S. Department of Agriculture did it because they wanted to bring broadband, so we really don't know if that's true. Thomas pled guilty to an illegal gambling charge, so he's a convicted felon. Believe it if you wish. This is what Mose Wright's church looks like today. On the left, that's what's standing of his church. That's where the funeral for Emmett Till had occurred down there the same day his body was found. And to the right is the cemetery. And if you actually look in the distance, you can see the remnants of the church. This is where Emmett Till had a hole dug to be buried. And the little red car there actually is my car. So that was taken this summer. That's what it looks like today. Okay, you've seen that. That's from Jet Magazine. They allowed the photographer in, and by allowing the photographer in to take those photos, and the open casket is what changed everything. This is what the Sumner County Courthouse looks like today. When the Ethics Center was established across the street, not the Ethics Center, but the Till Memorial, what's the name? Intrepid Center, thank you. It's a museum, essentially. There's a museum down in Sumner. Then there's also another group in Chicago. They are coordinated. They have cross-board members, but they are separate entities. This group was established in 2014. They went to 2016 and said to the courthouse, we want to give tours in there. They said, absolutely not. We will not remember anything about Emmett Till. The courthouse was falling apart. They elected for the first time ever a black commissioner. The black commissioner said, we need to do something about this courthouse, and this foundation is willing to help us raise money for it. So the foundation raised $4 million and renovated the courthouse to the 1955 standards. It is a very interesting place. That is exactly the way it looked in 1955. And I can tell you from personal experience, and maybe these two have different experiences, I walked in, my legs started shaking. I had to sit down because I've seen pictures of that courthouse, of that trial. And it took me, it hit me hard. And so at that time is when they put that sign up that you may have seen in other photos. This photo down in the lower right is the jury room. It's essentially as big as the table, and the door to the jury room is right there. That's where the jury sat. That's where the witness sat. So you tell me they couldn't hear. Is there more photos? The left on the photo is from the jury box looking out. Lower right is looking from where the black reporters were required to sit, separate from the white reporters. And the upper right-hand corner is a 4x4 room where the witnesses were held. Mamie Till sat in that room for 2 days. There was no air conditioning, no fans. It was 118 degrees in that building. And she was in a tin room for a day and a half by herself. She had to bang on the door to even go to the bathroom. Okay, another video.
It began September 19th, 1955. Every defense attorney in town volunteered to represent Milam and Bryant. According to press reports, a defense fund raised $10,000, and an all-white jury was seated. For his 1963 thesis, Whitaker interviewed them all.
Everyone treated me well. Everyone was very open about it. All the lawyers, both sides, the judge, all the jurors, all gave me interviews.
And what Whitaker learned about the jury pool is eye-opening. The man in charge of picking the list of jurors was the county attorney. The county attorney at the time was John Whitten, one of Milam and Bryant's defense attorneys.
He handpicked the jury. He assured that the list from which the jury was taken had only people that he was pretty certain were totally racist and who would think nothing of killing an African American.
The Tallahatchie County District Attorney was Gerald Chatham. He requested help from the state to take on this case. Attorney and former FBI agent Robert Smith III was appointed as special prosecutor.
I'm very proud that my father took that stand. Nobody had ever really prosecuted a white person in Mississippi for killing a black person.
And Smith and Chatham had many challenges. The hand-picked jury pool they may not have known about, but they would have known they were not getting help from their own investigator, Tallahatchie Sheriff H.C. Strider. Strider was a staunch segregationist.
We never have any trouble until some of our southern niggas go up north and the NAACP talks to them and they come back home.
Sheriff Strider was also running things in the courtroom, and he demanded segregation, even among the press.
The sheriff, H.C. Strider, declared at the beginning of the trial that there would be no mixing, no race mixing, as he called it. So the white journalists were not supposed to interact with the black journalists.
But what Strider didn't know was that not only were white journalists interacting with black journalists, they were all working together to further the investigation of the case, along with the NAACP and the sheriff of LaFleur County, George Smith. It all began with a tip to Dr. T.R.M. Howard.
This guy named Frank Young. He had information that people had witnessed, African Americans had witnessed, Till being brought into equipment shed in a farm.
Dr. Howard was a well-established doctor and civil rights activist based in the all-black town of Mound Bayou, Mississippi.
And this is the day before the trial. So the trial was scheduled to occur on Monday. This occurred on Sunday. He gets NAACP people together like Medgar Evers, Amzie Moore, ultimately goes to black reporters and he says, look, we have evidence here that this had occurred. We got to go find these witnesses.
Simeon Booker and Moses Newsom were among those reporters.
Our driver was Medgar Evers, who drove us to all those back yard plantations and plains where we were trying to find witnesses back there. We changed clothes and went out wearing something like plantation workers would used to be wearing. We did round up a couple of people who did actually testify in the case.
And that's how people like Willie Reed were discovered and brought into trial.
In the field, they come across the field while they done that.
Willie Reed was just 18 years old.
Then nobody swayed me to it, you know. But I mean, I just did the thing because I had to tell the truth because that was the truth.
Willie Reed, Mamie Till, and some members of the black press also stayed at Dr. T.R.M. Howard's compound in Mound Bayou.
So his house was here, or it was over there?
No, see where that house
Oh,
is?
where that house
That's
is.
where his house was.
It burned down mysteriously, I guess, right?
You could see
1,000 acres.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was all continuous.
back in there.
Yeah.
Nothing is left of T.R.M. Howard's Mound Bayou home today, but in 1955, it was quite the place. And for those associated with the trial, it was secure.
It was highly secure because Mound Bayou is an all-black town, and Howard had 24-hour security that he'd had for quite some time. He was heavily armed.
I didn't know anything at all about Mound Bayou. I didn't know it was an all-black town. I didn't know that the people in Mound Bayou did not tolerate any invasion of any kind.
That the Iowa House was just like you trying to get into the White House because he had his guards out there. You couldn't go through there.
Willie Reed was a surprise witness at the trial. His testimony, a key link in the case.
It won't establish the time and place of the actual murder, but it will connect the defendants with the crime.
He testified to seeing Emmett in the back of a 55 Chevy truck with two black men, including one he knew, Levi Too Tight Collins.
I saw that truck when he went down, it passed me, and I saw that young boy, and I saw Too Tight Collins on their car.
Reed testified he saw four white men in the cab of the truck, and then to hearing a beating at the barn in Drew and seeing J.W. Milam with a gun.
Now, later on in the morning, did you see Mr. J.W. Milam out there?
Yes, sir.
Where did you see him?
When I passed by, he came out to the well.
And was that J.W. Milam the man who was sitting over there?
Yes, sir.
Did you see or hear anything as you passed by the barn?
I can hear somebody hollering. And I heard some licks, like somebody was whipping somebody.
And I told him what these people did and what I saw, and I told them the truth because they did kill their boy.
He said he don't think he could live with it. He don't think he could have lived knowing that he heard all that noise and heard that child hollering and crying and don't say anything.
Willie Reed's widow says what he witnessed bothered him his entire life, that he would sometimes have night terrors, and that he always stood by his decision to testify.
One thing that really touches me is that one of the witnesses, 18-year-old Willie Reed, this guy put his life on the line. He came in and had the courage.
Mose Wright famously testified first, standing and pointing out both J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant as the men who took Emmett from his home.
So he knew by testifying he could be killed for this. But he said a man has to do what a man has to do. And he did it. He did something that no other black man had ever done in Mississippi and lived to tell about it.
It was a real climax. I suppose the first time a black has ever pointed to a white person in Mississippi, accusing him of a crime where he could be executed.
The defense's case hinged on disputing the identity of the body found in the Tallahatchie River as actually being that of Emmett Till. Mamie Till testified she saw her son's body and she had no doubt.
This is the defense team's closing argument. Every last Anglo-Saxon one of you has the courage to free these men and warn the jurors your forefathers would turn over in their graves if these boys were convicted on such evidence as this. The jury took less than an hour and came back with a guilty verdict. They would have been done in 20 minutes, except that they took a soda break. Interesting enough, what came out in 2007 is that they were not unanimous for the first two votes.
People on the other side of the river.
That's correct. Okay, one more video.
After more than 200 failed attempts to outlaw lynching, Congress is finally succeeding in taking the long overdue action by passing the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act.
Chicago Congressman Bobby Rush sponsored the legislation.
I could not have named it that mill after a more deserving example of what lynching, the horrors of lynching.
The Senate has now finally addressed one of the most shameful elements of this nation's past by making lynching a federal crime. That it took so long is a stain, a bitter stain, on America.
For the President Biden to sign the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act into law means that, America has made a statement.
There is something that has emerged that we can take some solace in, and that is that the name Emmett Till is going to live on in the context of justice. Every time somebody is brought to justice in the case of a lynching as it's defined in the law, the name Emmett Till will be spoken again.
And ultimately, Emmett Till's story will be kept alive. His life remembered. A legacy.
The verdict was unjust, but because of that verdict, Emmett's still memory and legacy is still alive.
Well, you need to get the truth out there. That's why I try to show the truth, the real truth, and somebody will believe it.
For him to have died a hero would mean more to me than for him just to have died.
Those sites are important and they are heavy. Here in Chicago, we can learn more about Emmett Till's life and we can celebrate the determination of his mother, who refused to let America turn away from a gross, intolerable injustice. Her bravery and strength in 1955 helped inspire and spark the civil rights movement.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 450, an act to award posthumously the Congressional Gold Medal to Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley.
Okay, so we had like I said, we had a tour guide when we went down there. And the tour guide said to me, I'm going to be in Chicago in 2 weeks. She's originally from Chicago. She moved back down there because she had family. And she asked me if I wanted to go to a presentation in Chicago. The Indianapolis Children's Museum has a traveling show alongside the Smithsonian that has traveled the United States for the last 2 years. Will end this December in Memphis at Martin Luther King's assassination site, the museum there. And so it was going to Chicago in 2 weeks and she was going to go up there and she invited me. She says, it's an invitational event. I said, well, who's going to be there? And she said, the Till family. And I said, I think I might stand out. And she said, no, there's going to be 500 people there. So I got invited and I actually went. So that day of it, I went to Chicago and saw the sites. And by the way, it referred to those sites being National Historic Sites. That actually has occurred in 2023. President Biden named 3 sites: the church in Chicago where his body was shown, the Sumner Courthouse, and the Grable Landing where his body was found are National Historic Sites as of today. And I actually talked to our tour guide the day that occurred because that picture at the White House of the signing of the anti-lynching law, she was there. And she said that she could not make it to the declaration of these National Historic Sites, but she sent me a picture of her with her new hat. her National Parks Board hat. Yeah. So she invited me. And so I went up there and I went to these various sites, and I was going to show you some of the photos. Left is the second boyhood home of Till. That's actually where he was before he went on the train. He'd only lived there for 2 years. If you saw the movie Till that was directed by Whoopi Goldberg, the proceeds from that movie are renovating that facility to open in 2025. Mamie and her mother lived on the second floor. Other relatives lived on the first floor. That's in the south side of Chicago. Down the street, they have the Mamie Till Forgiveness Garden, where she went after Emmett died, and that's where she would cry and pray. This is the Roberts Church now. It's pretty dilapidated. That's what it looked like when people were in line. And notice the Catholic salvage group next to it. The Catholics were at the forefront of civil rights. They were in the march from Selma, and they were on the right side of history. This is Emmett Till's burial site. This is in Summit, Illinois, which used to be called Argo. And I brought a prop for Argo. You've never heard of Argo? Yes, you have. That is the corn plant in Chicago that people from the Delta went up. Hundreds of people went up there, including Mamie Till and then later her husband. So it was originally called Argo. It was changed to Summit. His gravesite is still there. Now, mind you, he was exhumed in 2005, but his is easy to find because it's got all these flowers around it. Other places in that cemetery are not, including the one on the lower right. That's Mose Wright burial site. After the trial, he did not go back home because he was told that it wasn't safe for him to go back home. So he slept in the cemetery at his church. And then the next day he went to his house, got one suitcase. Now, he didn't own the house. He was a sharecropper. He got one suitcase, left the family dog behind, and got on the train with Chicago. This is in Summit. This is Emmett Till's other boyhood home from when he was born in 1947, I believe it was, or 47, until he moved away. I think it was in 51. He briefly lived in Detroit because his mother got remarried and they moved to Detroit because her husband's from Detroit. Then they eventually moved back to that other place that I just showed you. And in 2023, they put up the statue of Mamie Till at Argo High School. And it's a really neat statue because it spokes of this circular wheel, essentially, or how far it is to all the different sites that are involved in Emmett Till. This is the display of the museum. When I went to the event, it was at the DuSable African American Museum in Chicago, across the street from the University of Chicago. There was a panel discussion in an auditorium, about 500 people, essentially the who's who of civil rights in the United States that are in the Chicago area, including Jesse Jackson's entire family was there. President Obama was invited. I sat in that room of 500 people thinking, what in the world am I doing here? And then my tour guide found me. Oh, by the way, these are the part of the museum sites. Most of these things at museums, you're not allowed to take photos of. I didn't ask. There was no prohibition. These are some more of the portions of the museum, the traveling museum. Notice the sign up there. That is the second sign that was shot up at the riverside. The first one is in the Smithsonian in DC. And then this traveling show, after it gets done, is going to move to the Summit outside the courthouse in the Historical Center there, because it's the National Parks Board. Okay, who are those two people? Who's the other guy? It is Reverend Wheeler Parker. I talked to him twice. That is the last survivor of Emmett Till. He was in the house. And how did I ever become connected with him? It's an interesting story because I was reading his book among all these different things I've read. Came out in 2023. I was about 2/3 of the way through it. I realized that he was a pastor in Chicago, an active pastor. I looked up his church, found his email address, sent him an email. He called me. This was on the New York Times bestseller list. This was published in January 23. His book is a little different than the others. His is about the closing of the FBI investigation. because he was an informant to them. And they said that he cannot reveal anything he learned in there, including a memoir that was written by Carolyn Bryant to be released 10 years after her death of her part of the story, which is part of where Timothy Tyson said that she recanted things, but not in her book. She didn't. She said she was as much of a victim as he was in her book. Yeah. I sent him an email and I asked him, I said, here's something that confuses me about this whole story. I said, you talk about Simeon Wright, which is this book. You kept calling you your uncle, but you say he's younger than you. Is that true? He says, yeah, he's 4 years younger than me. And then he told me about the 20 kids and all that. And then he put me in touch with our tour guide, and that's how I got connected with her. So I'm at this event in Chicago. She sees me. She says, come here. And you could just see her doing it after meeting her. She grabbed my hand, pulled me over, says, you need to meet Reverend Wheeler Parker. And so she comes up, says, Reverend Parker, this is Pat. He says, is that the guy from Purdue? Who I talked to like 6 weeks before? And I said, yeah. And he said, oh, I'm so glad to meet you. He says, what'd you see down there? And I told him I went to the barn, and I said, it took my breath away. And he said, I won't go there. I will not go there. And then I said, I've got something to show you too. And he says, what's that? And I showed him the picture of his grandfather's grave. Oh. And he put his hand on my arm and he said, oh my God, I've never been to that gravesite. I said, why? He said, well, when my grandfather died, I was sick and the family wouldn't take me. And believe me, the cemetery is not laid out very logically up there. It's hard to find things. It took me an hour in the cemetery to find it, to get the photo. And so I gave him the photo, and then I gave him the directions that I had, and I circled where it was, and I gave it to him. And he said, I might go. I told him about the seed barn. He says, I will not go there. I refuse to go there. He said, that is too hurtful. And so I would talk to him for about 20 minutes because we were around a corner, and there's literally hundreds of people. Then all of a sudden people realized where he was. And so there was a line now. And I said, you know, it's just an honor to meet you, sir. And I said, I have a favor to ask you. And he kind of looked at me really confused. He says, what's that? I said, you're a pastor. Can I pray with you? So we clasped hands. This is hard for me to say. We clasped hands, and I thank God for meeting him and for the gift that Emmett Till has given us. And he started crying. So why is this all important? Textbooks are removing civil rights history. Emmett Till is barely mentioned in U.S. history any longer. Civil rights, for some reason, has become political, not historical. Slavery has become political, not historical. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and I'm not trying to get political, I'm just using direct quotes. Slaves developed skills in which some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. Fox News host Jesse Waters, no one is arguing slaves benefited from slavery. No one is saying that that is not true. They are teaching how Black people develop skills during slavery. In some instances, that can be applied for their own personal benefit. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Okay, this is in your handouts, and I wanted to have volunteers read those because it says, how are we to respond to what we have learned? So these are reflections that we can read. So if I could have volunteers, someone want to read the first one. Zelda.
Well, when you get to the page.
Yeah.
Right back. Oh, well, see, thank you. Okay.
Not organized. It's hard to do.
Have I fully loved God and fully loved my neighbor as myself?
Have I caused pain to others by my actions or my words that offended my brother or my sister?
Have I done enough to inform myself about the sin of racism, its roots, and its historical and contemporary manifestations? Have I opened my heart to see how unequal access to economic opportunity, jobs, housing, and education on the basis of skin color, race, or ethnicity has denied and continues to deny the equal dignity of others?
Is there a root of racism within me that blurs my vision of who my neighbor is? have I ever witnessed an occasion when someone fell victim to personal, institutional, systemic, or social racism, and I did or said nothing, leaving the victim to address their pain alone.
Have I ever witnessed an occasion when someone fell victim to personal, institutional, systematic, or social racism with me inflicting the pain, acting the opposite of loving God and loving neighbor?
Have I ever lifted up and aided a person who fell victim to personal, institutional, systemic, or social racism and paid a price for extending mercy to the other? How did I react? Did my faith grow? Am I willing to grow even more in faith through my actions?
Some things to reflect upon. And then I'll have a closing prayer, and then I'll have some other closing comments. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. And I ask you to join me as I read this prayer. God of heaven and earth, you created one human family and endowed each person with great dignity. Aid us, we pray, in overcoming the sin of racism. Grant us with grace in eliminating this blight from our hearts, our communities, our social and civil institutions. Fill our hearts with love for you and our neighbor, so that we may work with you in healing our land with racial justice. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in unity with the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I've got lots of books here that I've read. Like I said, the Simeon story is one that you cannot put down. Once you start it, it is so engaging in what happened. This one's a lot thicker. This is Reverend Wheeler Parker's book. It is like 500 pages, but it gives a very interesting aspect to the FBI investigation, why that was stopped. Remembering Emmett Till from Dave Tell, who was interesting in one of the videos. His is a very academic approach to it, and his is, what does this all mean, essentially? Death of Innocence, this is Mamie Till Mobley, who the co-author of that was Chris Benson, who is also in the video, and he was the co-author of this book as well. He's a professor at Northwestern. I met him and talked to him briefly up in Chicago as well. Death in the Delta, story of Emmett Till. This is more about the social impact of it. And this is just some of the dozens and dozens of books that have been read. Here are some of the other things that I picked up at different civil rights sites over the years. And so you're welcome to borrow those. If you want to borrow those, get it back to Zelda. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with is this, the way I started, is who is our neighbor? And so from Luke, so which of these three do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves? And he said to him, he who showed mercy on him. Then Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. Okay. This is also from the USSB. We have prayed now. With changed heart, let us move our feet to action. So I'm going to open up to any kind of reaction, questions, or comments that you wish to make from what you've heard tonight. Yes, ma'am.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing all of this. But I just finished the Simeon's story book, and
fascinating.
Yeah, one of the things too that struck me, that the members of who were in the house that night when Emmett was abducted, the mother never slept in that house again, and the family all left. They all moved to Chicago, and I just thought, there was such trauma for all of them, and it just made me think of just the idea of trauma and what it does to a person's psyche and how it affects the rest of their life. And it's just a very humbling, like, oh my God, these people suffered tremendously.
In our world, we think we're going to call 911. Mosrite went to the sheriff the next day and he said, what do you want me to do about it? Yeah. That his his great nephew had been abducted. What do you want me to do about it? You're black people, you have no right. Other questions, comments? Yes, ma'am.
So these two black youths that were in the truck,
They were workers for Leslie Milam. Leslie Milam was the manager of the seed barn where Emmett Till was killed. And then there were some others that were workers for J.W. Milam on his farm as well. They were hired hands, and they needed help to hold Emmett Till down. Well, yeah, it's like, well, you know, and when I talked to our tour guide, Sumner, Mississippi, population of 400 where the trial occurred. She said, you need to understand how racist this town still is. I said, what do you mean? He said, you see the railroad tracks to the west of the courthouse, 100% black. East side, 100% white. I said, how can that be? He said, there's a realtor, a black realtor on one side, there's a white realtor on the other, and if black comes to a white realtor, she calls somebody in town, they'll pay her 25% of the asking price that day. It is still 100% segregated. They can vote now, and she says, you have to understand that the blacks here depend on the whites for their jobs. So they're not going to raise help. Yet today.
Reagan, one of the southern racist votes.
Yep.
You went to Lynching and
Yep.
whatever you did to the South.
Correct.
And 1964, 65, when they did some civil rights law, he said biggest law to follow the South.
That's correct.
And so when they was first did outdoor route, he went through their Lynching. They're still trying to get the racist southern vote.
There was a reference to the fact that we had an all-white jury. It's because there were 0 blacks on the voting list. Nobody could sue it. And still, it's less than 5% black voters. They're still controlled economically by whites.
I was glad to see that Willie Reed lived a long life. You know,
Yeah, and you know where Willie Reed was when they found him? He was one of 5 people in a neighboring county jail under an assumed name. It was Medgar Evers and that the guy that had the doctor who had control of the town that found him. And that's how he was brought to the trial. Now, nowadays, you couldn't do that because you can't introduce a witness at the last minute the defense doesn't know about. But they were hiding witnesses under assumed names. That was H.C. Strider. Yeah.
You know, because it's a tremendous courage to stand up.
Absolutely. So the question I have for everybody here is that you've heard this story and it's a nice history lesson, but what does it mean today? So when I was in Chicago at the end of the panel discussion, there was a very interesting question that the moderator posed and said, what are you going to do about it? So you heard all these things. It's history. It's also current. What are you going to do about it? Are you? I mean, certainly we can pray, but it also takes action. And I made the stupid mistake of going up to the executive director of the foundation down in Mississippi, and I introduced myself, and he says, "Oh yeah, I just missed you that day when you were there with your tour guide." And I said, "I got an idea for you." He said, "What's that?" I said, why don't you engage volunteers across the country who will talk regionally in high schools about why the story of Emmett Till is important? Guess who the first volunteer for that program is? Yep. So what are you going to do about it is the question I'm posing, because racism still exists in this country. And, you know, the USCCB, interesting enough, has a mass against racism. And I would think that would be something your committee might want to take up and see if one of the priests want to have a mass on it. Because the more you bring it to people's attention, the better. Now, you may not think it even occurs here, but do any of you remember Brother Dwight? He was a very dynamic, boisterous, flamboyant brother in the Dominican order. He eventually left the Dominican order, became a priest. He's out in Seattle. And I remember he and I got to be good friends because he was involved in RCA and I was. And he told me a story that I could not believe. He said one day after he preached after at the announcement portion, that he went in the gathering space, and 3 college students came up to him and said, how long are you gonna be here? He said, well, I'm gonna be here for the school year. He's still gonna preach, yes. I don't want a nigger preaching in my church. At St. Tom's. We got work there. And I just couldn't believe it either. An institution of higher education, how in this day and age?
That was when Dwight was here.
Yeah, Dwight was probably here 10 years ago, 9 years ago.
Oh, boy.
No, I don't think so.
It was a long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, can you imagine?
Probably Jackson. Yeah, Tom Jackson. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we would invite you all to the racial equality and justice as we explore issues and learn about racism. So, you know, we have meetings on the first Tuesday of every month. So
there's another action you can take.
Well, we, you know, the greatest revolution is a simple change of heart. So that's what we're trying to do by educating ourselves.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring up that it's sort of tangential, but the August 28th, that's no coincidence, I'm sure.
For
The,
the day of the murder of their Martin Luther King.
well, they're both the same day.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think it's the genius of Byron Rustin that put that speech on the date, the anniversary.
Yeah.
Emmett Till's death.
Yeah, and actually that speech was changed the night before because in his speech, he actually was referring to Emmett Till.
Oh,
And
really?
it was told by advisors to take it out.
Oh, my gosh. Oh, my gosh.
It was in the original speech.
I think there's a PBS.
He thought it was too controversial. He thought it would take away from his message.
There's a PBS movie production coming out about Byron Rustin, which is long overdue.
Yeah. Well, you see in my biography, I've got the different books that I've read and a lot of the videos. I didn't realize I had done that many until I put together the list. They are fascinating, and you've got my different reactions, which ones you want. I have that as a Word document. I can email it to you. There's live links in the email, but they obviously aren't in print. And Zelda has it as well. Been a very attentive audience. I'm sorry it went so long, but I thought it was very useful and interesting. And feel free to look through a bunch of different books. You want to borrow some, don't take the cornstarch. But you're welcome to any of these others if you want to borrow it. If you want to read that one, go right ahead. I wrote it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm gonna stick around if you want to hear other stories, like you want to hear my Charleston story.
That girl.
It's similar to Reverend Parker's story. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Really.
Excellent. Add more books to my pile.
Yeah, right. Right.
I see Argo in a plastic container.
Yeah, yeah. And I didn't buy this intentionally for it. I had it before I went. I just had it in my cabinet. I saw it. That'll make a good prop. Thank you. This one.
Is that on this list?
It is. And I have it. And she actually gave me another one I actually should put in there, but it didn't directly relate. But Daughters of the Rebel, Daughters of Boycott. It was about the bus boycott in Montgomery, and it's written by the daughters of the people that did it, including the PBS reporter. That was fascinating. Fascinating.
I work at the library, so I'm gonna see if this is.
At Purdue Library?
No.
West Lafayette?
Tippecanoe County.
No, Tippecanoe County. Well, make sure they have those books, because if they don't, I'll donate them.
Write down the one about the daughters of the.
Oh, Daughters of the Revolution?
Daughters of the Boycott.
Or Daughters of yeah. Okay. I did? No.
I know. Thank you.
You're welcome. John, good to see you.
Just a quick follow-up on my question. I assume she continued to live just kind of a normal life.
Mamie Till?
Yeah, no, Carolyn.
Oh, Carolyn Bryant?
Yeah, I mean, just accepted member of society down there.
She divorced her first husband because, believe it or not, he abused her. What a shock, right?
Yeah.
So she got divorced and then she moved away from the area for a while after he died, and then she moved back. And then she eventually became sick and